The first thing Helena noticed was not the papers. It was the way her daughter's fingers disappeared into the sleeve of her school cardigan, slowly, nervously, as if little June already understood that adults were about to do something cruel and call it necessary. The headmistress's office was warm with polished oak and afternoon light, but the air had turned thin, the kind of thin that made every breath feel witnessed. On the wall behind the desk, the school crest gleamed in brass. On the table between them, untouched tea had gone cold. Julian Cross did not sit like a man asking for understanding. He sat like a man delivering a verdict. His suit was charcoal. His jaw was clean and hard. His gold watch flashed each time he turned another page in the folder before him, the way some men let wealth speak for them when their character cannot. Beside him sat Danielle Mercer, elegant in pale cream, and a smile too soft to be innocent. Her hand rested on Julian's wrist with a familiarity that no decent room should have tolerated. Headmistress Wren kept her face composed, but Helena could see the strain in it. The woman's pearls trembled slightly when she swallowed. "I'm afraid the order is effective immediately," Julian said, sliding the document across the desk. "The children will be released only to me or to Ms. Mercer until the hearing is complete." June looked up sharply. Elias went still in that dangerous way boys do when they are trying not to cry. Helena did not touch the paper. For 3 seconds, perhaps 4, no one moved. The muffled sound of children laughing somewhere outside drifted in from the courtyard, unbearably bright against the ugliness inside that room. Danielle crossed one silk-clad leg over the other and gave Helena a look dipped in pity. "This doesn't have to be difficult," she said, her voice low and polished. "The children need stability." Stability. Helena let the words settle. It landed like dust on a grave. Her husband had filed for emergency custody that morning. He had done it quietly, efficiently, while she was still arranging flowers for her mother's memorial service. And now, in the office of the school her children had loved since nursery, he had brought his mistress to collect the shape of a family he had already decided was his to redistribute. June's eyes found Helena's face, searching it the way children search the sky during a storm. Helena placed one hand gently over her daughter's small, cold knuckles. Then she finally looked at the folder Julian had pushed toward her. The top page was stamped, signed, legal, sharp as a blade. And beneath the paper, nearly hidden by the edge of the file, she saw the school's embossed seal. Her seal. Her fingers rested on the desk. Her voice, when it came, was quiet enough to make everyone in the room lean toward it. "I see," she said. Nothing in her expression changed, but somewhere deep beneath the stillness, something ancient and exact began to rise. And Julian, in all his confidence, never noticed. Helena Cross had spent most of her married life being mistaken for a woman with very little power. Not because she looked fragile. She did not. There was strength in the clean line of her shoulders, in the measured grace with which she moved through rooms, in the discipline of someone who had learned long ago that composure was sometimes the only form of privacy the world would allow. But Helena had a quietness that careless people often confused with absence. It had followed her since girlhood. She had been born Helena St. Clair, the only daughter of a family that did not advertise itself. The St. Clair fortune had never screamed the way newer money did. It built hospitals without naming wings after itself. It endowed universities and vanished from speeches. It bought failing schools, repaired them, expanded them, and let the children inside believe the miracle had come from nowhere. By the time Helena inherited controlling ownership of Arden Crown Education Group, the company's value had passed $55 billion. Its crown jewel was Halcyon Ridge Academy, The private institution where diplomats' children, ministers' sons, scholarship prodigies, heirs, and overlooked dreamers all learned beneath the same stone arches and cathedral windows. It was one of the most coveted schools in the Western Hemisphere. Helena owned the parent group through layered family trusts, chaired the board under her maiden name, and almost never took the stage. She preferred classrooms to cameras. Julian had never cared enough to ask what, exactly, her board work meant. That was the wound beneath all the others. Not merely betrayal, but incuriosity. A marriage can survive storms. It rarely survives a man who stops looking. When Helena met Julian 13 years earlier, he had been magnetic in the way certain men are before ambition hardens into entitlement. He was brilliant, sharp-witted, hungry. She had mistaken hunger for depth. He admired her poise, her intelligence, the steadiness she brought to his restless life. At first, he treated her silence like something sacred. Years later, he treated it like a vacancy. He rose in corporate law, then private equity. He learned how to enter rooms already acting as though he owned them. He learned the social uses of cruelty, the subtle humiliations that left no bruise, but changed the weather of a home. By the end, his infidelity was less an affair than a philosophy. Danielle Mercer, all lacquered charm and strategic softness, fit neatly into it. She was younger, louder, decorative in the ways Julian now preferred. Where Helena carried dignity, Danielle performed desirability. Julian called that honesty. Their house in Westbridge stood behind iron gates and flowering hedges, wide enough to make loneliness echo. The marble floors held the day's coolness even in summer. Staff moved softly through its halls. The children's paintings hung in the breakfast room, beside expensive art no one really looked at. In photographs, it was a beautiful life. In truth, it had become a museum of managed silence. Still, Helena stayed measured. For Elias, for June, for the small daily rituals that made a childhood feel safe. Pressed uniforms laid out at night, piano scales after dinner, cocoa on Fridays, stories spoken low through half-open bedroom doors. She was the one who remembered which teacher made June feel seen, which subject turned Elias inward, which corridor smelled of chalk dust after rain, which of their fears were spoken, and which were hidden beneath brave little smiles. Julian mistook that devotion for dependency. Danielle mistook it for weakness. And because Helena never argued in public, because she never competed for attention, because she carried old power the way other women carried grief, close, unseen, and without spectacle, both of them stepped into her life assuming they understood the architecture of it. They did not. What they saw was a wife in muted silk, arriving quietly at school events, leaving before photographs, listening more than speaking. What they did not see was that the ground beneath their feet had been hers all along. The custody order did not appear in a vacuum. By the time Julian carried it into the headmistress's office, he had spent months arranging the atmosphere that would make such an act seem plausible. Cruelty, Helena came to understand, was rarely sudden. It was usually rehearsed. It began in smaller rooms. At dinner parties, Julian interrupted her with the polished impatience of a man correcting a child. If she offered an opinion on finance, education policy, philanthropy, anything beyond the domestic scope to which he had mentally reduced her, he smiled and said, "Helena likes to keep up with these things." As though her intelligence were a hobby. The table laughed because Julian was charming, and because too many people mistake confidence for credibility. When donors from Halcyon Ridge attended events at their home, he introduced her as very involved with the children's school. Never once as the woman who had funded 2 new research campuses, 3 scholarship endowments, and the restoration of the school's oldest library wing. Helena let it pass. At first. Then Danielle appeared more openly. Not announced exactly, introduced by accident, included by necessity. Julian had a habit of making indignity sound administrative. Danielle was a consultant. Danielle was assisting with branding. Danielle needed to join them at lunch because schedules were difficult. Danielle would be at the charity gala because she was managing guest relations. Danielle would ride with them to the school music recital because it was on the way. Each explanation was thin enough to see through. Julian offered them anyway, certain that saying a thing calmly made it true. Helena noticed details before she noticed the whole pattern. A lipstick mark on a water glass in his study. Danielle's laugh on speakerphone, too intimate for office hours. A silk scarf left in the back seat of Julian's car, perfumed with amber and orange blossom. A message lit briefly on his screen one evening while Elias was showing him a science project. Can't wait until she's fully out of the picture. Helena said nothing then. Elias was standing right there. But silence was changing shape inside her. It was no longer the silence of endurance. It was becoming the silence of measurement. The children noticed more than Julian understood. June began asking if Danielle was Daddy's work friend or Daddy's special friend. Elias stopped volunteering to accompany his father anywhere. At bedtime, Helena would find him awake, staring at the ceiling, already old in the eyes. Then came the meetings. Julian began speaking about Helena's emotional instability in the careful language of concern. To her face, he suggested therapy with the sly benevolence of a man planting future testimony. To others, he referenced her grief after her mother's passing, her tiredness, her withdrawals from social life. He described normal sorrow as fragility. He reframed dignity as detachment. One afternoon in the kitchen, sunlight lying across the marble island in broad gold bands, Helena heard him telling Danielle on the terrace, "She's not equipped for what's coming. She collapses inward. That's her problem." Danielle's answer came with a soft laugh. "And your solution is me?" Julian did not lower his voice. "My solution," he said, "is the children being with someone who knows how to create warmth." Helena stood by the sink, one hand resting on the cool stone, and listened to the quiet clink of china in the drying rack. Outside, birds stitched through the hedges. Somewhere down the hall, June was singing to herself. Warmth. Women like Danielle always claimed warmth while leaving cold behind them. The next humiliation came at Halcyon Ridge's winter concert. The chapel was full, parents in wool and cashmere, candles trembling in iron sconces, children's voices rising under the vaulted ceiling. Helena arrived early, as she always did, and found her usual seat near the aisle. Julian entered 20 minutes later with Danielle on his arm. He did not ask if Helena minded. He did not hesitate. He simply sat Danielle between himself and the children's grandmother's empty chair, as though substitution were a natural law. Several heads turned. A whisper moved. Helena felt it pass over her like winter air under a door. When the concert ended, June ran into Helena's arms first. Julian's mouth tightened. "Let Danielle congratulate them too," he said, too sharply, in front of other parents. Danielle bent down in her cream coat and touched June's hair with an intimacy that made the child shrink almost imperceptibly. Elias stepped between them without thinking. That, more than anything, stayed with Helena later, the instinctive way her son moved to shield his sister. The adults around them saw awkwardness. Helena saw a line crossed. Still, she did not make a scene. That was what Julian expected. He wanted noise, something he could point to, something he could call volatility. Instead, she became quieter, and that unsettled him more. He began coming home later, speaking more bluntly, testing the edges of how much disrespect a marriage could bear before it dissolved. He criticized the children's routines, then blamed her when they became unsettled. He questioned school decisions in areas he barely understood. He accused her of hiding behind manners. Once, in the study, with rain striking the windows and the smell of leather and old paper thick in the room, he said it plainly. "You have no idea how the real world works, Helena." She looked at him across the desk. Julian, flushed with his own authority, did not know he was saying this to the woman whose signature could move entire institutions. He did not know because he had never cared to know. And Helena, seeing at last the full poverty of the man she had married, understood that whatever would happen next could no longer be prevented by patience alone. 3 days after the custody papers appeared, Halcyon Ridge hosted its annual Spring Founders Reception.
It was exactly the kind of event Helena once loved from a distance. White tents on the lower lawn, strings of ivory lights woven through old trees, chamber music drifting above the low murmur of cultivated voices. The stone facade of the school glowed honey gold in the late evening. Staff moved with silver trays. Mothers wore silk. Fathers wore certainty. Helena went because Elias was receiving an academic distinction, and June had painted one of the student portraits displayed in the East Gallery. Whatever Julian was doing to their marriage, the children would not feel her absence. She arrived alone. The air smelled faintly of clipped grass and lilies. The fountain in the central court sent up a steady silver hush. Helena wore black satin, simple and severe, with her mother's earrings, small diamonds that caught the light only when she turned her head. For the first half hour the evening held. She congratulated teachers. She knelt to look properly at June's portrait. She listened to Elias explain, in his careful, serious way, how the award itself mattered less than the fact that he had earned it without help. That made her throat tighten. Then she heard Danielle laugh. The sound carried over the courtyard before the woman herself came into view, gliding on Julian's arm in a dress the color of champagne. Several parents looked between them and Helena. No one spoke, but attention sharpened. It always does around a woman being publicly replaced. Julian did not steer Danielle away. He brought her directly toward Helena and the children. "Elias," he said, all brightness, "Danielle wanted to see your certificate." The boy did not move. June lowered herself behind Helena's skirt, peeking around the silk. Helena held Julian's gaze. "This is a school function." "Yes," Julian said, "and Danielle is with me." The words landed like a slap because of where he said them. There, beneath the school crest, with teachers nearby and parents pretending not to stare. Danielle smiled with the practiced gentleness of someone performing reasonableness for witnesses. "No one wants discomfort, Helena." A small silence opened. Then Julian reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and withdrew another envelope. Cream. Heavy. Legal. He handed it to her in front of everyone. "Since you refused to discuss it privately," he said, "my attorneys thought public service might be more efficient." The paper was not merely a notice. It was a petition. He was seeking accelerated primary custody, alleging emotional unsuitability and inconsistency in the home. Attached was a declaration naming Danielle as the children's stabilizing day-to-day female presence during transition. June, old enough to understand tone, if not language, began to cry soundlessly. Elias's face went white with fury. Several guests looked away. Others looked harder. Helena stood in the center of it all, while the evening lights trembled softly above her, and a string quartet played on from the lawn, as though nothing indecent had happened. It was not just betrayal. It was staging. Julian had chosen witnesses because humiliation ripens faster in public. For one suspended moment, Helena felt the full impact of it. The insult to her motherhood, the theft of her dignity, the vulgar confidence of a man who believed reputation could be arranged like furniture. Danielle placed one manicured hand lightly against Julian's arm, claiming her position without words. Helena took the envelope. Her fingers did not shake. She looked down once at the school seal embossed on the invitation tucked beneath the legal petition. Then she looked back up at Julian. There was no anger in her face. That unsettled him. Anger would have made him taller. Instead, he saw something colder and far more final. Completion. Helena bent toward June, wiped the tears from her daughter's cheek with the pad of her thumb, and handed Elias the award certificate so carefully it felt ceremonial. Then she straightened. Without a word, she turned and walked toward the east corridor, her heels making a quiet, measured sound against the stone. She did not look back. But by the time she reached the shadowed archway beyond the lights, she had made her decision. Julian would never again confuse her silence with surrender. The next morning, Helena rose before dawn. The house was still dark, the windows faint mirrors holding the last blue hour before sunrise. She moved through the kitchen without turning on the main lights, letting only the under-cabinet lamps burn low against the marble. The kettle warmed. Somewhere upstairs, the children slept. Their breathing, when she had checked on them minutes earlier, had been even and soft. Helena stood at the long counter in a cream robe, one hand around a cup of untouched tea, and opened the envelope Julian had given her. Every page was precise. Every accusation carefully phrased to sound reluctant, responsible, deeply concerned. His lawyers were good. They had arranged rumor into paperwork. They had given cruelty a professional font. At the bottom of the stack, Helena found the line that mattered most. Danielle Mercer had already been added, by Julian's request, to the school's authorized guardian list, pending formal custodial review. She read it twice. Then she reached for her phone and dialed a number she had not needed in years. It was answered on the first ring. "Good morning, Mrs. St. Clair." Helena closed her eyes briefly at the sound of her maiden name. Not from nostalgia, from recognition. "Good morning, Malcolm," she said. "I need the board counsel, the family office legal director, and a private hearing room at Halcyon Ridge by Friday." There was no surprise in the voice on the other end. Old institutions do not survive by asking foolish questions too early. "Yes, ma'am." "And Malcolm," she added, looking out through the dark glass toward the pale line of dawn, "pull every access authorization, visitor record, internal communication, and trustee notice involving Julian Cross or Danielle Mercer from the last 12 months. A small pause. Understood. When she ended the call, the kitchen felt different, as if the room itself had remembered who she was. That day, Helena said very little. She packed the children's lunches herself. She pinned June's hair back with steady fingers. She knelt to straighten Elias's tie and told him softly, "Whatever is loud is not always true." He held her gaze a second longer than usual. Then he nodded. Julian watched all this from the doorway, one hand around an espresso cup, already dressed for the city. He mistook calm for defeat. "I hope you're being sensible," he said. Helena did not answer. By noon, she was in the older quarter of the campus, entering through a side gate few parents ever used. The air smelled of damp stone and trimmed ivy. Her heels struck the path with a muted rhythm as she crossed toward Ashbourne House, the original administrative building, where the Foundation archives and executive chambers sat behind carved walnut doors. Staff members who passed her greeted her not casually, but correctly. "Good afternoon, Chair." "Welcome back, Ms. St. Clair." "Boardroom is prepared, ma'am." Helena gave only small nods. No audience, no announcement, just movement. In the boardroom, a long table of dark wood held 3 envelopes placed in exact alignment beside a silver water carafe. The blinds were half drawn, striping the room with bars of softened light. On the far wall hung the original charter of Arden Crown, framed beneath glass, its ink faded but still legible. "Education is stewardship," it read, "not possession." Helena stood before it for a long time. Then Malcolm entered with a leather portfolio and set it before her. Inside were the records. Julian's requests to alter school pickup permissions, Danielle's attendance at restricted family functions, internal notes from uneasy administrators. A message written by Julian to the operations office referring to Helena as non-executive family member. Another requesting that staff defer to Ms. Mercer in maternal logistics. The arrogance of it was almost exquisite. Then came the court material. Helena read the affidavit Julian had filed, describing her as grieving, withdrawn, less consistently engaged in the children's social and educational life. She read the implication that Danielle had become necessary because Helena had receded. For the first time in days, she smiled. Not with joy, with clarity. People who lie in writing often make the mistake of lying specifically. By evening, instructions had been issued quietly through the channels Julian had never bothered to learn existed. Trustees were alerted. Security protocols reviewed. Legal counsel prepared a response not only to the custody filing, but to the fraudulent misrepresentation of school authority. One director in Geneva woke to an encrypted message. Another in Toronto canceled 2 meetings. A judge, long familiar with Helena's philanthropic work, agreed to an expedited review once the full documentation arrived. And Helena herself performed the smallest acts with the greatest care. She signed each paper with a fountain pen her mother had once used. She placed certain documents into a cream envelope, others into black. She requested that 2 chairs be added to the founder's dais at Friday's reception, and that no explanation be given. She instructed Headmistress Wren to say nothing, no matter what Julian demanded. That night, back at the house, Danielle called while Julian showered. His phone vibrated across the bedside table, lighting the dark in soft gold. Helena read the preview without touching the device. "Will it all be done by Friday?" She turned the screen face down. In the bathroom, water thundered through marble and glass. Down the hall, June murmured in sleep. Helena sat at the edge of the bed for a moment, the black envelope resting in her lap, and listened to the sound of her own breathing. A storm was coming. But storms, she knew, did not always arrive as noise. Sometimes they arrived as paperwork, placed very gently on a table. Friday evening came wrapped in polished elegance. The final founder's reception of the term was larger than the spring gathering. Parents, trustees, benefactors, select press, alumni whose names opened doors in several countries. The great atrium of Halcyon Ridge shimmered under chandeliers that made the marble floor look almost liquid. Music drifted from a concealed quartet balcony. Waiters passed with crystal flutes. Conversation floated upward beneath the glass ceiling in refined currents of power and vanity. Julian moved through it as though the room belonged to him. He had brought Danielle again. This time she wore deep green and a look of quiet expectation. Rumor had done its work. Enough people had heard some version of the Cross family trouble that their arrival drew attention before either spoke. Julian liked attention when he could control the angle of it. He assumed Helena would stay away. Instead, at precisely 7:20, the hum in the atrium changed. It was not loud. It simply shifted, as weather shifts before lightning. People turned toward the upper staircase. Helena was descending slowly from the east gallery. She wore ivory silk this time, severe and luminous against the dark banister, with no jewelry but a slim watch and her wedding ring. Still there, not as sentiment, but as record. Her hair was drawn back. Her expression was unreadable. On either side of the staircase, two senior board members had risen from their conversation and stepped back as she passed. That was the first sign. The second was Headmistress Wren, who had been speaking with a donor near the central fountain. The moment Helena reached the floor, the headmistress inclined her head fully. "Madam Chair." The title cut through the atrium with more force than if it had been shouted. Julian's face altered by degrees. First confusion, then denial, then the faintest blanch beneath the skin. Danielle looked from one face to another, finally realizing she was the last person in the room to understand where she was standing. A hush spread. Conversations thinned and broke. The quartet stopped mid-phrase. Helena did not look at Julian immediately. She turned first to Elias and June, who were standing with their form tutors nearby. June broke into motion at once, running across the marble floor into her mother's waiting arms. Elias followed more slowly, but when Helena rested a hand at the back of his neck, the boy's entire body released a tension no child should have to carry. Only then did she face Julian. "Good evening," she said. He stared at her, as if language itself had become unreliable. "What is this?" Helena's gaze did not leave his. "Truth, arriving on time." She extended one cream envelope toward him. An envelope moment. Soft paper, steady hand, a room full of witnesses. Julian did not take it at first. Malcolm, standing just behind Helena now, with the family office legal director and school counsel beside him, made the choice irrelevant. "You have been formally removed from all discretionary access related to Halcyon Ridge and Arden Crown, pending judicial review," counsel said evenly. "Effective immediately." Danielle's breath caught. "Removed? On what authority?" Helena turned to her then, at last, and the stillness in her eyes was so complete that Danielle's posture faltered before a word was spoken. "Mine," Helena said. Nothing in the room moved. For years, Julian had lived beside a woman he considered decorative in the margins of his life. Now he was looking directly at the architecture of his own humiliation. "This school," Helena continued, her voice calm enough to make every syllable land harder, "is the founding campus of Arden Crown Education Group. I am its controlling owner and executive chair." A collective intake of breath passed almost invisibly through the crowd. Some of the older trustees already knew, of course. Others knew pieces. But many parents did not. The revelation moved through them in silent waves. Recognition, calculation, embarrassment on Julian's behalf. Helena accepted a second envelope from Malcolm. Black. Heavier. "This contains copies of the affidavit you filed," she said, "describing me as uninvolved in my children's education, unstable in grief, and absent from their daily school life." Julian found his voice. "Helena, whatever performance this is." She lifted one hand, not sharply, just enough. He stopped. "You added your mistress as guardian at a school you did not know I owned," Helena said. "You instructed my staff to defer to her."
"You misrepresented my role in the children's lives, interfered with institutional procedures, and attempted to leverage a private family betrayal into public administrative control." Each sentence was delivered almost gently. That was what made it devastating. Danielle flushed, then paled. "I didn't know." "No," Helena said. "You did not ask, either." The line landed cleanly. No cruelty in it, only judgment. School counsel stepped forward and addressed the room with formal precision. Verified records had been submitted. Internal authorizations had been improperly obtained through material omission. A response had already been filed in family court. Emergency motions were now in process regarding both parental interference and reputational damage. Until further notice, Danielle Mercer was barred from campus. Julian Cross was restricted to supervised communication regarding the children pending immediate review. The terms were legal. The effect was biblical. Julian looked around the atrium, perhaps expecting rescue from familiarity. From donors he had dined with, parents he had impressed. The invisible masculine fraternity that so often cushions men from consequences. But power is loyal only to itself, and tonight it was leaning elsewhere. "You lied to me," he said finally, as though he were the injured party. Helena's face remained still. "No," she said. "You never listened." Silence. Under the chandeliers, with the whole polished world of Halcyon Ridge watching, Julian seemed for the first time exactly what he was. Not formidable, not wronged, but small. A man who had mistaken access for authority. A man who thought a woman's refusal to advertise herself meant she had nothing worth discovering. June held tightly to Helena's hand. Elias stood straighter. Helena reached for the final document in the cream envelope and gave it to Julian at last. "This," she said, "is the divorce filing." He took it, but his fingers had lost their certainty. "And this," she added, her voice dropping softer still, "is the last time you will ever attempt to hand my children to another woman as though motherhood were a chair you could reassign." There was no rise in her tone, no spectacle, no scene. Just truth, just ending. Just a man and his mistress standing in the borrowed glow of a school that had never belonged to them, while the woman they tried to diminish reclaimed the room without raising her voice. By morning, the world around Julian had begun to rearrange itself. Consequences, when they come cleanly, are often quiet first. His law firm requested an internal review after whispers from the reception reached senior partners before breakfast. Not because of the affair, men like Julian are rarely punished for appetite, but because he had filed sworn material containing statements now contradicted by institutional records, governance documents, and multiple school officials. Reputation, in his circles, mattered less as morality than as risk. Danielle, barred from campus and suddenly stripped of the fantasy into which she had stepped so confidently, stopped answering certain calls. Public embarrassment has a way of clarifying private devotion. By the end of the week, the apartment Julian had leased for her in the city was empty, except for white roses gone brown at the edges and a robe left on the back of a chair. The family court hearing moved quickly once Helena's legal team entered the full record. The judge, a woman with silver-framed glasses and a face weathered by decades of hearing wealthy people weaponize children, did not disguise her displeasure. Temporary primary residence was affirmed to Helena. Julian's application was rebuked. Supervised visitation remained until further evaluation. The language of the ruling was crisp, almost restrained, which made it all the more severe. At Halcyon Ridge, staff walked differently around Helena after the reveal. Not fearfully, respectfully. The kind of respect that comes when mystery resolves into substance. Teachers who had always liked her now understood why decisions improved when her name appeared in the margins of meeting notes. Parents who once nodded past her now paused. Some looked embarrassed when they realized how often they had mistaken understatement for insignificance. Headmistress Wren visited Helena privately and apologized for the distress of that first office encounter. Helena spared her the burden of extended absolution. "You protected procedure with the information you had," Helena said. "Now you have more." That was enough. The children changed too, though more gently. June stopped waking in the night. Elias laughed again, but with caution at first, as though joy had become something to test before trusting. They spent more evenings in the old library at home, curled together beneath lamplight while Helena read aloud. The house itself seemed to exhale. Rooms once tense with anticipation settled into usefulness again. As for Julian, the collapse was not theatrical. It was worse. It was incremental. Calls unanswered, invitations withdrawn, a partner suddenly too busy for lunch. Men who once admired his decisiveness now speaking to him as though he carried contamination. He discovered, much too late, that social power can evaporate not only through scandal, but through ridicule. There is a special humiliation reserved for a man who publicly attempted to dominate a woman whose ground he had not even recognized. Helena did not gloat. She signed documents, attended meetings, walked June to the art room and Elias to science lab, reviewed scholarship proposals, sat through legal briefings, chose wallpaper for the children's study nook. She moved through consequence the way she moved through everything else, with order. And because she did not chase revenge noisily, it stayed pure. Those who watched from the outside called it justice. Those who understood her better called it proportion. Several weeks later, on a clear evening washed in gold, Helena stood alone at the edge of the lower lawn behind Halcyon Ridge. The school day had ended. The corridors were quieter now, carrying only the distant residue of children's footsteps, the closing of lockers, the soft scrape of chairs being stacked. Beyond the chapel, the sky opened in wide, pale bands of apricot and blue. The fountain sent up its patient silver sound. Somewhere nearby, roses warmed in the last of the sun. June and Elias were ahead of her with a groundskeeper's old spaniel, laughing as the dog refused every command with cheerful indifference. Their voices floated back through the cooling air, light at last, no longer braced. Helena watched them and let the stillness settle where pain had once lived. She had not won because she was richer. Not really. Money had only revealed what character had hidden. What defeated Julian in the end was not her fortune, nor the school, nor the lawyers, nor the documents placed with such devastating calm across polished tables. It was his own certainty that a quiet woman could be reduced without resistance, that a mother could be displaced if one used enough paperwork, that dignity, because it did not shout, had no force. He had been wrong in every direction. The evening breeze moved lightly against Helena's face, carrying the scent of cut grass and old stone. She thought of her mother then, of the way she used to say that some women survive by becoming smaller, while others survive by becoming impossible to move. Helena had chosen the second kind. Not loud, not bitter, not undone. Simply rooted. June turned and waved from the path. Elias called for her to come see something the dog had discovered under the hedge. Helena smiled, small, real, unguarded, and began walking toward them. Behind her, the great school stood in the fading light, its windows catching the last fire of day. Ahead of her, her children waited. And between those two truths, the life she had built and the life she had protected, there was finally peace.
Some betrayals break a woman open. Others introduce her to the full weight of her own name.
Helena crossed the lawn without hurry, her shadow stretching long beside her, and the evening gathered around her like a promise kept. Some betrayals break a woman open. Others introduce her to the full weight of her own name. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more powerful and emotionally unforgettable stories.